Welcome back to Women Writers in Chinese History. In this video, we'll talk about several different groups of writing women in Chinese history, as well as some basic historical developments, including that about foot binding, the most notorious custom associated with women's oppression in traditional China. Our last video ends on the topic of concubinage. Taking concubines was the sign of a man's prestige and power, since all these women were financially dependent on him and were supposed to bring him as many children as possible. No other man was more prestigious and powerful than the emperor, the son of heaven himself. Therefore, the so-called inner palace or back palace, 后宫, was where numerous women congregated as the spouses of one man, the emperor. Here we can see a map of the Forbidden City, Zijincheng or Gugong in Beijing, which was the imperial palace during the Ming and the Qing dynasties. The quarters in the back where buildings are denser or where the palace women lived. Typically, the emperor could only have one woman as his principal wife, that is, the empress, or hou, as well as a dozen of consorts with the titles of fei or pin, and many other palace women at lower ranks, whose role was sometimes similar to maidservants. Then how many women could there be in the inner palace? As a type of urban legend from the past to the present, the idea is that an emperor could have as many as 3,000 women at various ranks in the inner palace. However, at least for palace women enjoying titles or higher ranks, it seems that in most cases there were fewer than 100. Still, the total number of palace women was often large enough that some of them might never get the chance to have a relationship with the emperor or even got to see him in person. For this reason, the topic of the lonesome or abandoned palace women became a persistent motif in Chinese poetry. We'll see some of those examples later in this class. At the same time, we should know that some palace women were highly educated, as they usually came from upper-class families. Throughout different dynasties, the inner palace also had a long tradition of educating palace women in matters of ceremony and classical learning. Sometimes, palace women could be tutored by literate women from outside the palace. Moreover, historical records centered on the imperial family, so palace women had a better chance at having their writings and deeds preserved. For these reasons, the earliest known women writers in Chinese history all came from the inner palace, as we shall see. From the inner palace also emerged many powerful empresses who ruled on behalf of their young sons on the imperial throne, or sometimes their husbands who suffered from poor health. The most famous example is Wu Zetian from the Tang Dynasty, since she took the unique step of claiming the title of the Son of Heaven and became China's only woman emperor. We'll take a closer look at her rise to power, as well as her long-term assistant in the inner palace, Shangguan Wan'er, who's one of the most remarkable woman poets in Chinese history. Another famous example is Empress Dowager Cixi during the late Qing period. Since she was the supreme ruler of Qing China for decades in the post-Opium War era and came to be well known in the Euro-American world. Photography was invented during her lifetime, and the Empress Dowager was quite fond of taking photos, such as the one shown here. Other than palace women, another group of women who was likely to possess literacy was the so-called Gentry Women, that is, women from upper-class, scholarly families. Although it's not always the case, Some gentry women were highly educated in classical learning and literary writing. One famous example from this social group is Li Qingzhao from the Song dynasty. She is likely the most famous female writer in Chinese history, and we'll spend some time later on learning about her life and works. Next, a group of women who left writings behind is the courtesan, or Mingji. Similar to the geisha in the Japanese tradition, courtesans in traditional China were women with sophisticated artistic and literary skills in the pleasure industry. Since scholars were the social elites in traditional China, famous courtesans in Chinese history were typically those patronized by famous scholars and poets. Sometimes, these relationships led to her being ransomed and married to the scholar as a concubine. Famous examples of courtesan writers include Yu Xuanji from the Tang Dynasty and Liu Rushi from the late Ming period. We'll learn about their cases later. After introducing these different groups of writing women, we should further note the diversity within Chinese thought. It is well known that Confucianism, or Rujia, was dominant in the tradition, and we have discussed women's subordination in the context of the ritual system upheld by Confucian thinking. However, also prevalent in traditional China, though in less politically dominant ways, were Daoism and Buddhism. 道家, 佛教. In traditional China, Daoism and Buddhism became so integrated with Confucianism in social life that they became to be known as the three teachings, 三教. For understanding women's conditions, we should know that Daoism and Buddhism offered a source for more flexible or egalitarian gender views in the traditional context, owing to their orientation towards detaching oneself from the social and political world and from the family structure. Women could become Taoist or Buddhist nuns to avoid marriage, and some religious women left behind fascinating stories or writings, which we'll also look at later. Moreover, within Confucian thought itself, there was diverse tendencies and important historical developments. For now, we should know that ritual restrictions on women were relatively looser during the early periods of Chinese history. During the Song dynasty, around the 10th and 11th centuries, a Confucian revival movement known as Neo-Confucianism, Li Xue, dictated stricter codes for women's conduct, especially in terms of chastity. One well-known statement by a Neo-Confucian thinker from the period goes as follows: being starved to death is a trivial matter in comparison to the loss of a woman's chastity. 饿死事小，失节事大. With ideas like that, remarriage became scandalous for widows, and adultery was often criminalized. In particular, the influence of Neo-Confucianism was the greatest during the last two imperial dynasties, Ming and Qing, and the oppressions of women being attacked by the early 20th century feminist movement more specifically reflect the gender ideology and practices during those late imperial periods. Take, for instance, the most notorious sign of women's oppression in traditional China, foot binding, 缠足, by which women's feet were bent with her toes broken through forceful cloth binding for years since a very young age, such as 5 or 6, in order to remain small and achieve the so-called lotus shape. We should note that foot binding was not always the case during the traditional period, but mostly a late imperial phenomenon during the Ming and the Qing dynasties. earliest instances of foot binding possibly originated from palace dancers between the Tang and Song dynasties around the 10th century, and it was practiced on a limited scale among upper-class women during the Song dynasty. Foot binding became extremely prevalent during the Ming and the Qing dynasties, but only among Han Chinese women. Women of the Manchu ethnicity, that is the ethnicity of the Qing imperial family, for instance, did not bind their feet. In the late 19th century, anti-foot binding movements started to emerge, first through the efforts of Euro-American Christian missionaries. Later, it became one of the main missions of the feminist movement during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The practice of foot binding gradually phased out by the 1930s. From a modern perspective, the practice of foot binding is clearly cruel and oppressive. However, in recent years, some historians started to reflect how to write a history of foot binding beyond the simplistic narrative of its evils and women's victimization, for the purpose of restoring the women's subjective experiences and agencies in this history. The most notable effort of this kind is Dorothy Coe's Cinderella's Sister. If you are interested in reading a revisionist history of foot binding, or learning about the full complexities of the phenomenon, I would highly recommend this book. On this note, let us conclude this historical overview. Please complete the quiz below the video, and then watch the next video, which offers a brief account of modern revolutions and transitions.